Nothing about her is human, except that she is not a wolf. It is as if the fur she thought she wore had melted in her skin and become part of it, although it does not exist. Like the wild beast, she lives without a future. She inhabits only the present tense, a fusion of the continuous, a world of sensual immediacy. As without hope, it is without despair. That was an excerpt from Angela Carter's The Bloody Chamber, which is what I want to talk about today. Hi, if you're new here, I'm that horror girl. I also go by Ada, and here I talk about all things horror, horror media, horror books, horror history. So if that sounds interesting, maybe stick around. So I was first introduced to Angela Carter's Company of Wolves in my Year 11 English Lit class, and ever since then I haven't been able to stop thinking about it. I feel like every time I read it or I hear people's opinions on it, I get something new out of it, and it's really one of my favorite short stories. And like I said, I want to talk about her three that are associated with Little Red Riding Hood, which are The Werewolf, Company of Wolves, and Wolf Alice. And along with this, I actually want to talk about Neil Jordan and Angela Carter's co-scripted movie, The Company of Wolves, which incorporates these three stories, but most obviously, The Company of Wolves. So yeah, let's get into it. Okay, so the way I want to structure this deep dive is by first I'll tell you a little bit about Angela Carter, and then I want to go into the three stories. I'll give you a bit of a synopsis, my just initial thoughts going in, key themes, symbolism, stuff like that. And then I want to talk about the film and how it incorporates all of those, and then we'll have just a general breakdown of Angela Carter and her three stories as a whole, including the movie. So, Angela Carter was an English novelist born in 1940 who later died in 1992, and she was most well known for her The Bloody Chamber short story collection. However, she also wrote countless novels, other short stories, as well as children's books. And her works tackle mostly sexuality, gender, generational differences, and the human experience. And the Bloody Chamber stories are all subversions of classic children's tales, with the three that I'm talking about today being subversions of Charles Perrault's The Red Riding Hood, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, and how it warns against little girls speaking to strangers in the woods. But being written by a male author in a very sexist time, it also carries themes of women's place in society, and it actively punishes sexuality or sexually active or ambiguous, even women, placing the blame on them for subsequent injustices or even assault. And so Carter's depiction of Little Red Riding Hood is so important because it completely subverts this message and flips on its head to divulge themes and stories centered around the power in female sexuality. So, the movie Company of Wolves, written by Neil Jordan and Angela Carter, released in 1984 with a budget of 2 million and it ended up making 4 million at the box office and was widely considered a success. The entire film was essentially created practically, and it gives the whole film this kind of nostalgic, eerie kind of look, similar to like Dark Crystal, Promise Neverland, those kinds of movies. And it is really, really creepy. But let's get into the actual short stories associated with the film. So let's talk about the werewolf. It is a northern country. They have cold weather, they have cold hearts. And the book opens with telling us that these upland woodsmen believe that the devil is as real as you or I. They're a very superstitious village, and they live harsh, brief, poor lives. And the story follows a young girl as she journeys from her mother's house to her grandmother's house, armed with goodies for her grandmother as well as her father's hunting knife, which Carter tells us that she knows how to use. So she has her 5 miles trudge through the forest to get to her grandmother's house, and she encounters the werewolf, in which she cuts off its paw and places it in a hunting basket and continues on to her grandmother's house. And when she reaches it, she finds out that her grandmother has no hand. and that the wolf's paw that she has cut off has turned into her grandmother's hand. So, upon discovering that her grandmother is the werewolf, she calls the villagers for help, in which they break into her house and they pelt her grandmother to death. And the story ends when Carter says that now the child lives in her grandmother's house. She prospered. And that's the werewolf. So this story is probably the most obvious retelling of Little Red Riding Hood, and there are some pretty obvious themes of old versus young women, and how society favours younger women and in turn cast out and reject older women. Furthermore, the young girl in the story is also much more resourceful and capable than in Perrault's tale. An example of this is the knife that she knew what to do with. She's further strong, and she even lets out a loud cry at the end of the story to alert the villagers of her grandmother. The grandmother, on the other hand, is also independent. She lives away from the villagers and is in possession of what seems to be a large amount of wealth. But it's these things that allow her to be vilified and eventually crucified by the villagers in her being pelted to death. It never actually states in the story that the villagers understand that she is a werewolf, only that her granddaughter takes her place and inherits her wealth. And along with the symbolic replacement of the grandmother or with her granddaughter, these two women on their own provide statements and subversions of Perrault's depiction of little girls and old ladies. And another important aspect to this is that they are inherently against each other. They both cannot prosper, as Carter would put it, and with the existence of the other. It's reminiscent of society's obsession with younger women over older ones, but further that the society they exist in cannot be so that the little girl can make her own generational wealth. She has to take her grandmother's. She cannot make it herself. Even the knife that she protects her with isn't hers, it's her father's. And we know from the story that she is incredibly strong and capable. She cut off the wolf's hand by herself. But still, she needs to call for the villagers and get them to stone her to death rather than herself. So that is the werewolf. And let's get into the next one, Wolf Alice. Hello, it's a new day and I'm back with a bit of a costume change, so let's get right into Wolf Alice. So the story opens with a description of Wolf Alice, and we discover that she's not exactly half wolf, half human in the traditional sense. The only thing really wolf about her is her demeanor and how she acts and how she portrays herself, like she walks around on all fours, but aside from that, visually she looks completely human. And that's where we get that quote from the beginning of the video. Nothing about her is human, except that she's not a wolf. It is as if the fur she thought she wore had melted into her skin and become part of it. We learned that she was found as a cub when her mother, which is a wolf, was killed, and she's taken into a nunnery. And in this nunnery, we discover her true nature, where she refuses to act in any traditional human way. She snaps at her would-be saviors with her spiky canines, until eventually she is cast out of the nunnery and taken in by a character who we know to be the Duke. Now, the Duke is interesting because he is very clearly a werewolf. It even states this explicitly, but he is outcasted, and so he lives by himself in a manor in which he takes Wolf Alice in. And Wolf Alice spends all of her days alone, pretty much, and she goes through puberty and through womanhood. She has her first menstrual cycle, and eventually she grows up. And an important moment in this actually is when she encounters Amira, who previously throughout the story she saw her own reflection, thinking it was another cub just like her that she could play with. And the turning point in this novel really is when she looks into the mirror and discovers that it's her and that she's looking at herself. And so eventually the manor is broken into by the townspeople looking to kill the Duke. And so the Duke is struck and he's dying. And this brings us to the end of the novel, where because Wolf Alice has been so sheltered her entire life and her only real experience with people is with the Duke, and her only real emotional connection is with the Duke. As he's dying, Angela describes this as a prey being caught in its own fishing net, as the Duke dies happily, knowing that he has entrapped this young girl to care about him so deeply that she cannot perceive anybody else. And that is a quick synopsis of Wolf Alice. So, Wolf Alice to me is first and foremost about ostracization and lack of belonging. We see this especially in the character of the Duke, who we know to be a werewolf, ostracized by other werewolves. We even get a passage in the book explaining that if he were to join a werewolf pack, he'd be treated with no care or respect for the other wolves, and essentially to fend for himself. Wolf Alice, on the other hand, is interesting because she provides a subversion to this. She does not wish to be integrated with human society, and yet we see in the book that she would be accepted by wolf society. A noticeable moment of this maturity is when she looks in the mirror and discovers that it's herself instead of her playmate, and she sees herself truly for the first time. This relationship between the Duke and Wolf Alice is also interesting because he isn't really present, he's not there for her. He doesn't really give her any sort of parental guidance, and there is a noticeable gap in age. Subsequently, Alice grows up alone, which I feel is really reminiscent of how lots of young girls grow up without someone in their life to teach them the things that come with womanhood. And as a result, they make her susceptible to her relationship with the Duke, being the only relationship she has. At the end of the novel, the Duke is content, even though he is dying, because he has a young girl that cares for him very deeply. And you almost get the sense that she is his young bride because she's actually wearing an old wedding dress when this scene takes place. And Angela Carter says at the end, she's like prey caught in a web. Coming back to present day, I feel like Angela's kind of referring to the power that men have over young women, societally and socially, especially when that young girl is alone in the world without female mentorship, which Alice clearly lacks. So, those are my thoughts on Wolf Alice. Let's take a break and move on to the final story, Company of Wolves. So, in Company of Wolves, we're yet again in another harsh winter village, and she begins with about a half a page dialogue of the werewolf. And after setting the scene, she gets into a couple of short, kind of a sentence long interludes. So, the first short story that Carter gives us in The Company of Wolves is about a hunter who's looking to catch a werewolf, and he builds a pit and puts prey in the middle of it, I believe a duck, and waits for the werewolf to fall into the pit. And he goes down there and kills the werewolf, and when he is revealing it again to the villagers, they discover that it's turned into a man. And so that's the first kind of interlude we get. And then the second one is about a woman who's just been newlywed, and her husband leaves the house to go take a piss, and he never returns. So she moves on and has children with her second husband. One day, the original husband comes home and discovers that she has children of her own and flies into a rage and eats the foot off her eldest son and goes to kill her. But her second husband kills the first husband before he can. But at the end of this story, the second husband beats her for having relations with another man previously. And then we've got a third story. Now, this one's only about a sentence long, about a wedding party being turned into wolves by a witch who was previously married to the groom. And so now we're into the main story of The Company of Wolves, which is following a young prepubescent girl as she takes some goodies to give to her grandmother. This is quite similar to the setup of the werewolf. She's kind of described in the same way. Carter also describes her as that she is much too loved to ever feel scared. In this story, she encounters a man on her way, and he's obviously some kind of predator in this scenario. He's an older man and he has more experience. This appeals to the young girl, and he makes a bet with her that if he can make it to his grandmother's house before she can, then she owes him a kiss. So they part ways, and the girl dawdles on her way back, hoping to advance their relationship. And the man, of course, is a werewolf and makes it back before her, eating her grandmother, save for her burning hair in the fireplace. And so when the girl makes it back, she spots the hair and makes the discovery that he's a werewolf. And the story ends with the girl having sex with the wolf to avoid being eaten. And she kind of flips the power situation to her. Like she demasculates him by laughing and kind of making fun of him. And the story ends with her, as Carter says, between the paws of the tender wolf. So that was a shortish summary of The Company of Wolves, and let's get into my thoughts. So there's quite a lot of story content, metaphors, imagery in The Company of Wolves, so I want to talk about the interludes before we get into the main plot. So the first one being the wolf trapped in the pit by the hunter. This to me kind of only exists to set up the idea of wolves being men in disguise, or more importantly, the other way around. And she kind of integrates this into describing the werewolves themselves and the setting. But the second one, bringing us to the rich wedding party in which the participants are transformed into wolves by the groom's pregnant girlfriend. This scene is actually much longer in the movie, and it's only about a sentence in the book, but it still stands to reinforce Carter's message of patriarchal systems empowering infidelity in men while disenfranchising women. Class also plays into this, impacting women to a higher degree, obviously, because of things like pay gap, as well as women typically ending up in homemaker positions and not being able to make their own kind of social and economic power. This one is actually a rare example in Carter's stories of women successfully seeking revenge. In a way, as the story ends with the woman revealing the wolves and relishing in their misery as they howl outside her cottage. But I wouldn't say that's kind of a true revenge, if you know what I mean. So, the third story being the women with the two husbands, this one's most obviously about domestic abuse, and what I find interesting is that she's actually conforming to society's expectation of her. After her first husband leaves, she moves on and has children, as is expected of her by society, and yet the narrative, or more accurately, the men, punish her, even though she hasn't actually committed any infidelity. Both of her husbands accuse her of it, and her first husband even bites the foot off her son. Furthermore, her having children isn't glorified or seen as anything more than a burden. And this is shown more so in the movie, but it's still present in the narrative. The novel demonstrates that even when you do everything right as a woman, you can still be subject to, as Carter would put it, the hairy nature of violent men. And so finally, the main story. Our protagonist, the young girl, is set up as being very naive and childlike on the cusp of puberty and adolescence. As we get in this quote, she's been much too loved ever to feel scared, and children do not stay young long in this savage country. And then she makes her way through the forest, and the forest, feel like, is representative of her journey as a girl into a woman. Carter sets up the forest as kind of this foreboding place, especially to the girl's mother, as she would have experienced a similar journey in their harsh winter village. The brutality of the forest, I feel like, is symbolic of the struggles of young women. It's no easy task to get through puberty unscathed, and Carter does not represent it as a desirable path. The forest also represents the young girl's sexuality. She is told not to stray from the path or from the norm because that is what her mother expects of her, and her grandmother and probably her great grandmother were told. And while there is truth to genuine dangers in the forest, the characters use, or well, the mother and the grandmother use fear mongering to stop the young girl from metaphorically at least truly exploring herself. Despite warning from her mother and her conservative village, she is still open and curious about her sexuality, and she enables her relationship with the young man that she meets in the forest while he's still at least in his human form. It is clear that she's still innocent and impressionable, though by the end of the novel, when she re-emerges from the forest, she's essentially grown up in a way. And by the time the man is transformed into a wolf, the girl uses her sexuality and desirability to advantage and essentially asserts dominance over the wolf. At the end of the novel, the girl essentially wins, you could say, because she outdoes the wolf's sexual desire. She gives in to her desires, and she one-ups it, so to speak, questioning his masculinity in the process, and most importantly, she doesn't show fear, and so he's forced into submission. Of course, this is Carter making a statement about macho and secure men not being so tough after all. But this is also Carter enabling and rewarding sexual promiscuity and indulgence in young women. by making the young girl one of the only successful protagonists in her stories, having fully accepted herself and grown completely into her womanhood. She is making statements against marriage, against children, against generational tradition in favor of female power, individuality, and above all, sexual expression. And so those are my thoughts on the Comedy Wolves book. So let's get into the movie. Okay, finally, Neil Jordan's Comedy Wolves. I promise this is the last section. So the movie opens with, again, a prepubescent girl called Rosalie experiencing a fever dream. And we can kind of tell right off the bat that this is going to be a coming of age and a journey through sexuality as she's wearing her sister's red lipstick and clearly starting to experiment with her appearance and sexuality. This is further reinforced when we begin the journey through Rosalie's dreams. And she, or at least the girl she's dreaming about, is attacked by a teddy bear. And I kind of see this as childhood no longer accepting her. And the girl she dreams of, however, is eventually caught by wolves and killed. This is revealed to be Rosalie's sister in her dream, and after her death, she stays with her grandmother for the night. Notably, at the funeral, she asks her grandmother why her sister couldn't have protected herself. But the grandmother responds that she just doesn't understand quite yet.
Poor little lamb.
Why couldn't she save herself?
You don't know anything. You're only a child.
This dialogue serves to establish the grandmother as a traditional woman with the associated traditional values of men protecting women, um, and that women can't protect themselves, but further as a roadblock for Rosalie by not explaining or allowing Rosalie to be aware of how she can protect herself or why this is. She's trying to instill those same traditional values onto her granddaughter. Now, so far this opening is pretty different to the book, but it establishes Carter's key themes with the audience pretty early on so that we can later make sense of the stories and the imagery. And I can definitely see why they didn't go with the book opening for Comedy Wolves. And so this is when we get the phrase from Granny,
"And never trust a man whose eyebrows meet."
and this is subsequently repeated a few times by the grandmother throughout the film. And now we're on to the first story. So they're actually in a different order to the movie, and the first short story is The Woman with the Two Husbands. And in the movie, her having children is so much more of a burden than in the book. Like she seems truly exhausted and trapped in her position as a housewife. And we get probably my favorite wolf transformation I've ever seen on film of all time. It's like really epic. I actually don't know if I can show it on here because it's pretty gross. So when he's killed by the second husband, we get a shot of his severed head landing in a bucket of milk. And it's pretty gruesome.
Hi, this is me editing. Apologies for the audio and video quality. For some reason I lost a clip of me talking about this, but pretty much it just is another example of the merging of wolf and man to me, but we kind of already have that. So it landing in the milk, being, white and kind of like a symbol of purity and nourishment in childhood, is tainted by the wolf's blood and turned pinkish to red, I guess, to demonstrate the effect of men's actions onto the pure and innocent around them, not just young girls, but onto young boys as well.
So after Granny's first story, we get some pretty strong imagery of a couple of woodland creatures, most notably a snake hissing at Rosalie, which I believe you can kind of look at in like an Adam and Eve way. Representative of the snake tempting Eve to eat the apple. The snake is enticing Rosalie into her sexual desires. But I mean that's a bit of a stretch. But oh well, that's what I think. This is also where we're introduced to Rosalie's potential young love interest, a boy from the town. This is clearly a crush unrequited by her, and she's sort of bemused more than anything by his attempts to interact with her. And then we are brought into another tale by Granny that actually isn't in the book, following a young girl as he has a run in with an ominous, wealthy man whom hands him an ointment. The boy puts the ointment on his chest and immediately begins turning into a wolf, or at least getting very, very hairy. It's a super short scene, but it kind of serves to show how society enables young men to grow up into monsters and into werewolves. He's given this ointment by a very rich, white old man, And he kind of, I feel, represents like generations. He's holding a skull in the car, you know, great grandfather, grandfather, father type deal, passed on to the son. So after this, Rosalie joins the young boy on a walk in which he attempts her to kiss him, and she's very resistant and instead follows Doves off the path. And it shows her straying from her family's tradition and not accepting the traditional path. She doesn't accept or is interested in the boy that her family believes to be the correct choice for her to pursue. And she does eventually kiss him and then runs away, abandoning him. But he calls out for her in the woods. The people of the town believe that there is a wolf running around, so they set up a trap and catch one, and upon killing it, discovering it to be a man, which, if you remember, is the first short story in the book. So Rosalie, back home, begins to tell her mother the story of the wedding party, which is essentially the same plot as the book. It's just a bit drawn out and longer, but it's got some really silly werewolf transformations. And now we're actually up to Rosalie's main journey through the woods. Now, what's explored in the movie, not so much as the book, is that Rosalie's clearly not interested in men her own age, and instead is enticed by older men, probably because of the perceived experience and maturity. At least that's what they exude in the movie. Thus far, her experiences with men her own age have been proven to be unrespecting of her boundaries and unfulfilling to her. So even though this older man is much more of a threat to her, especially when she realizes that his eyebrows meet in the middle, what the grandmother has been warning about pretty much the whole movie, she still allows herself to be charmed and curious. And she's still incredibly naive in the movie, much more so than in the book, and thus framing her as being kind of manipulated. Her journey through the forest, however, is the same as the book, as in the way that when she emerges, she has symbolically kind of completed her journey into becoming a woman. But she is notably much more scared and childlike than the book would portray her. She still flips the power dynamic to be in her favor in a similar kind of way. The movie, however, doesn't end here, like the book. And instead, while we've been hearing all these stories from her grandmother, Rosalie herself becomes the storyteller and gives us a final story of a young wolf girl, kind of like Wolf Alice, being accepted by a priest. And once she's been accepted, she melts back into the water into the town well, and we see a white rose slowly turn red as she finishes the story. And then we cut back to Rosalie, who has turned into a wolf. Her mother and father discover her, and her father tries to shoot her, but her mother defends her. And this is my favorite moment in the film because it shows that Rosalie's mom has accepted her truly and is breaking the generational cycle. It's a rare moment of maternal acceptance that we don't really see anywhere else in the film, especially with how resistant the grandmother is. Her mother understands, as she stated earlier in the film, whatever beast lives in men meets its match in women too. And we cut back to Rosalie in real life, where wolves break in through her window. And that is the end of Neil Jordan's Company of Wolves. This is by far Carter's most well recognized and important story. Carter stated in interviews and many a time that she believes literature represents a vast repository of outdated lies, essentially meaning that it reflects fears and beliefs in the time that it was written in. And in this way, she uses fairy tales and folklore stories, giving us women in less than ideal conditions. And through her storytelling, she's encouraging her female audience to act out and to do things that within their desire or that brings them pleasure. She disagrees with marriage as a concept entirely and shows any and all relationships between men and women as an inherent power struggle, as well as the relationships between other women as a social struggle. These relationships project her own feminist ideals onto the typically heavily anti-feminist and generational superstitions we find in our classic Red Riding Hood. And so the purpose of Company of Wolves, and really in any of her stories, is to demonstrate how superstitions, conservatism, and fear-mongering is passed down through generations from grandmother to mother, from mother to daughter, and to show how this doesn't exactly have to be how generations should evolve and to challenge those expectations. And so those are my thoughts on Neil Jordan's Company of Wolves and Angela Carter's Bloody Chamber. I'm just a girl on the internet, and these are my opinions, so take everything I say with a grain of salt. But thank you so much if you made it this far, and I hope to see you next time.